Okay, with Ryan Braun, director of the 120 program, the lecturer in the University of Florida. Please, could you give me like a quick little description of Beyond 120? Just 30 seconds.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start by explaining the name. So, as some people may know, it takes 120 credit hours to earn a bachelor's degree from the University of Florida. So the underlying philosophy of Beyond 120 is that from a student perspective, your approach should not be to just accumulate enough classes and credit hours to get to 120 and then graduate, because you won't be sufficiently prepared to maximize your postgraduate experience. And so what we do in Beyond 120 is connect students to those experiences that can amplify their college journey. So things like internships, engagement with undergraduate research, study abroad or global engagement more broadly, but also things like mentorship and basic career and professional development. So as someone once said regarding college, it's not really where you go, it's how you go. And we try to help people go better.
Awesome. Awesome. So maybe looking at it from above, a good first question would be, why do this at all, right? Why go to college at all? Is it even worth it? And what would be your perspective on that?
It's a great question. And it's an important question. And I think that people who are skeptical of whether going to college is quote unquote worth it come by that skepticism honestly.
Yes.
I was one of those people. When I graduated from high school, I did not go to university right away. I went a few years later, and I had not expected to go. My parents didn't go. It was not a norm in my community. And I had certain reservations about college that I imagine a lot of people do. The first and biggest just being cost. Just you know, just being is that I was very economical about it. I kind of thought is for the price, is the thing I'm getting out of it worth it? And that was unclear to me for a while. The second skepticism I had that some may share is I wasn't sure if I was a cultural fit for a university. As I said, I came from a bit of a sort of a small town. I grew up in small town Kansas.
Yeah.
And I had some stereotypical perceptions of college as sort of full of elitist, condescending people who think they're smarter than they really are, kind of guy, you know? But it was really the economical barrier that I thought about.
Yeah.
The ultimate answer to that question, which is extremely strongly supported by the data, is that it is worth it. And there's a few different metrics that you can look at if you want to be really pragmatic. The easiest one is earnings over time. In the United States, a bachelor's degree holder will earn a little bit above $1 million more than someone who has not earned a bachelor's degree over their working lifetimes. Right. Now, college is expensive.
It is.
It's not $1 million expensive.
It's not.
So if you're trying to do a pure cost benefit evaluation from an income standpoint, on average is worth it. Now, how useful are averages? So one thing that I know is discussed quite a bit is, but I got to go into a lot of debt. I have to take out a lot of student loans. And what generally is substantiated by data is that if you finish your bachelor's degree, you will be in a position to pay off your loans over time and have more professional opportunity. Where some of the horror stories happen is folks who take out relatively large, tens of thousands of dollars of loans, and then don't finish the bachelor's degree. Because now you've paid the price and you have not received the product, if you will.
Yes.
So from a financial standpoint, the data suggests it's worth it. Now,
before you go on the financial standpoint, I want to linger a little bit because definitely I have to, unique perspective. One being a STEM major, and a STEM major that luckily what I really, really like and what my research area and what my area of expertise that I want to go in industry really pays good.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's very lucrative.
Certainly.
Right? So I'm very lucky on that side because I have also the perspective of some majors that, in my mind, from this point of view, are not really worth it. Right? For example, you could argue some specific majors that if you take loans, it's very difficult or very unlikely that you eventually pay it all in a reasonable amount of time, right? Maybe just because of the major you chose, not necessarily the university cost, because of course it depends on like whether you go to a private, public, super expensive, or cheaper options. It might be worth it or not, but regardless of that, in my mind, there's some majors that there's definitely a lower chance of really making an income and making it worth it. What's your perspective on that? And definitely, because I'm not too familiar with CLAS, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, maybe there are some majors in the department that fall into that category.
Really good point. Really good point. So there's a couple points here. The first is, what is the real relationship between an undergraduate major and a profession? That wildly differs depending on the major. So in fields like engineering, for example, or accounting, there is a really, really firm alignment, generally speaking, between academic discipline that you chose to study in college and the job that you're going to do after you graduate.
Yeah.
That is not the norm. That is the exception. For the vast majority of undergraduate majors, there is not really an alignment with a profession.
Right.
Right? Think about it.
Yeah, definitely that's not where my mind goes.
There's not an alignment with the profession.
My mind is, you're an electrical engineer, you go do electrical engineering jobs.
Right. Right. And the reality is, this is a relatively modern phenomenon. For most of the history of American higher education, there was not much of a connection to career. And even once there started being in the early 20th century, there was only a few majors to choose from anyway, and yet there was still an incredibly broad spectrum of professions. The point of a college education, ultimately, is to cultivate a certain set of skills and a certain set of perspectives. And then you use those skills and perspectives in the marketplace. You exchange your skills and perspectives generally for an income.
Yeah.
In most workplaces, most industries, the major is almost irrelevant. Outside of some of these very specific things, some of these very specific STEM fields and accounting, you're almost never going to see a preference of major. You're going to see a preference of skills. We want someone with strong communication skills, the ability to collaborate, critical thinking, effective problem solving. And I think there's this sense among a lot of people that those are buzzwords.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Those are real things, and maybe the most important things human beings can do. And you have to meaningfully learn to do them. And you can do that through an English degree, a music degree, an engineering. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And one thing I tell students a lot is there's this false perception of a college degree as though it operates like a ticket. Like, I got my degree. You take your ticket over to Job World. You say, here's my ticket. Job, please. No, it's a toolbox. You have to sort of unbundle the degree itself. So let's take a major. Let's take my undergraduate major, English. English is made fun of a lot. We get a hard time with English majors. It's kind of the typical, like if people are making fun of college, it's like, oh, go pay all this money to go be a barista or whatever. But I think that, and sure, some of this, to some extent, that is true. That's true of every major. But what I don't hear a lot of is, well, what do you think English majors go do?
Right.
And
I
it's
have no idea.
no idea, because the reality is that the distribution of professional outcomes for English majors is about as broad as the professional world itself.
Got it.
I had a conversation last week with a graduate of our college, graduate of the English department, who is a chief executive at a major company.
Interesting.
And didn't do graduate education, bachelor's degree in English, executive in a major company. And he talks a lot about how most of the people that he works with, they're sort of, MBAs from Harvard and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But he's risen because of his ability to communicate and present complex ideas in ways that other people can understand.
Yeah.
Hard to think of a better business skill than that. He learned that by reading Dostoevsky, right? And the writing papers about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I hear this extreme skepticism about the quote unquote real world applicability of some of these majors,
Yes.
it just strikes me as a tremendous lack of imagination.
Yeah. And I might have fallen into that trap too, because I was, definitely if somebody says, oh, I'm majoring in English, it's like, oh, are you really sure you want to do that, right? And maybe you can touch on that of how would you talk to somebody that's starting and is trying to strike a balance of, I really want to do this, but I want to make a living, right? I want to be useful to the market, right? Do you have to make that decision? Or probably what you're saying is that you don't really have to make the decision. It's like you just should go to do whatever you want to do or whatever you want to study, because at the end, speak on the value of classes itself, because the perspective, that the toolbox that you get from college, it can be acquired from the classes. But I, for example, from engineering perspective, tend to think of it as it's not really that way. It's like the skills that you put into practice in industry don't come necessarily from classes. Classes are a foundation to give you really just a foundation, just the bare minimum knowledge of how to, like the minimum set of tools to tackle a problem. But when they give you the problem that you have no idea what to solve because nobody in your classes told you how to solve that problem, you have to figure out how to do it. And the way you know how to figure out how to do it better is by extracurriculars, like getting involved in labs, getting involved in research. So is that kind of the same that you see in the other majors?
Oh, yes, huge. And frankly, this was the impetus for Beyond 120 as a program, was because, for some of these majors that have the closer alignment with sort of academics and industry, like engineering or accounting or some of these others, the experiential options are relatively clear. Right? Do an internship in this particular kind of field, which will set you up for this particular kind of job. And what we noticed was, particularly in some of these majors that we've been discussing, maybe some of these, humanities, social sciences, these majors that are powerful but are more broadly applicable, so it can be harder for people to target. What was happening a lot of the times was they just weren't doing these experiences because they didn't know which ones to do. Because, and I will say, while I don't like it when the English majors get made fun of and all of that, there is a problem on the other extreme as well. And anyone who's interested in these kind of majors has heard this before. I want to major in English. And what you were just saying, oh, you sure you want to do that? So there's a skepticism.
Yeah, it's a skepticism that if you have a plan of how to do that, awesome.
Right.
Take it on. But if you're uncertain, it's like, oh, I kind of like English, but I'm not sure what I want to do. It's like, oh, really think about it, right?
Yes. Well, yes, but there's the opposite side, which is all these well-meaning people who really want to support students and their interests, and they say, well, okay, what can I do with a degree in English? And the response is, you can do anything.
Right.
And it's like, that may be literally true, but it's certainly not helpful because it's like highlighting the whole book. You haven't narrowed anything down. You've just changed the font color. And so one of the things that we strive to do in Beyond 120 and as faculty mentors for these students is say, okay, you want to major in philosophy? Rock and roll. You can make a good, powerful living. a lot of people make phenomenal livings with a philosophy degree. But let's get a little bit more specific. Here are the 4, 5, 6 transferable skills valued by industry that a philosophy degree is likely to cultivate within you. And here are the 3, 4, 5, 6 most common places that philosophy majors go to apply those skills. Law and politics being the two biggest examples.
Okay.
So we have to do this connection. So if a student's like, I love philosophy, I can't imagine doing anything else, it gets me excited. It's like, okay, great, do that. But to your point, you're going to cultivate all these skills. Then where are you going to aim it?
Right.
We don't want you to wander. These are powerful degrees, but they are. It's very easy with these kinds of degrees to just kind of float.
Yes.
So we're trying to give them some direction here.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It doesn't have to be, and also important, it doesn't have to be the ultimate direction, right? You don't have to tell them, oh, philosophy, go to politics or something like that. Right? I think even in engineering, I always tell people just try things, right? We're back, but
oh, good.
I don't even remember where we left, so we can just continue talking about something else. I think one of the problems that I am seeing right now is that since I started the semester grad school, and I was telling you this before, one of the really cool things about my advisor is that she's very nice, and at the beginning she just told me, you can do anything you want. Right? Anything in this big whole ball, you can do anything you want. Still, this big whole ball is very big. So at the beginning, I was really struggling into figuring out, okay, I need to pick something because the whole idea of a PhD is to be an expert in an area.
It's true.
So I need to pick an area that I like, of course. Ideally, but I like everything. So what do I do? What do I pick? It's like I really struggle with that. It's like there's so many options, and it might be something that you were saying with the English degree. There's so many options that people can just freeze and say, "Ooh, I like everything." So what do I do? Should I just start on something and figure it out? Maybe I'm missing something else. What would you tell that person?
Well, I think what I would tell that person would be very different for an undergraduate student and a PhD student. For a PhD student, the answer, I think, partially can be a very tactical one, right? It can be, where are the meaningful gaps in the literature? Yes. What is in vogue? What are the sort of intellectual trends? Can you ride some waves? Because, your goal is to produce a meaningful dissertation, not change the world. And here's the piece that is, I think, somewhat universal. Okay. Whether you're a PhD student or undergrad, whatever you quote unquote pick from the circle, it's your first job. I think people think that they choose careers. No. You choose your first job. And now you're on the track. and you're flying down the track now. And you are going to change cars many times. Your career will take really sharp left and right turns that are awesome, but you never would have predicted for yourself. And so I think it is very easy for people sort of in their 20s to sort of to imagine finishing their education whenever that happens, assuming that they have now picked
their life. Yeah.
Not at all. You've picked your first job, Yeah.
And it really is something that I've noticed talking with people in industry, that I've had the opportunity to have internships and talk to people that are really doing cool stuff. A lot of people that are doing cool stuff didn't imagine that they were going to do that like 5 years before. And that's really, like there's something there that is like whatever decision you make, it doesn't define you for life, right?
Right.
Okay, cool. So maybe we can get back to the Beyond 120.
Sure.
So I want to really know, more practically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
what are the things that you do, or the knowledge that you give to people, or the lessons that propel them to have a meaningful direction after they graduate. So practically speaking, what is not don't pick it like a single course, but in the whole curriculum of the courses, what is the essence that you want to give to students?
Yeah, it's a good question. The essence is you have to be intentional about cultivating skills through experiences and then learning how to message those skills outward. For example, we have some courses on undergraduate research.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of undergraduate students think that the only reason to do research is because if they want to be faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's helpful. But, and you know this, engaging in academic research builds unbelievably relevant industry skills, project management, conflict resolution, data acquisition and analysis, teamwork. And what happens, what we noticed, so many students who engage in undergraduate research, when they are asked about it, the value they perceive from that experience is completely wrapped up in the results of the study.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They were struggling to understand that they had now enhanced themselves as a product.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they'd say they go to an interview and they'd be given a question, tell me about a time that you contributed effectively to a team effort. They'd go, oh gosh, I don't know. And they had just a few minutes before been talking about the research experience, but they were so hyper focused on this academic specifics of the experience, they were not identifying the more transferable skills. So we teach them how to notice those and then articulate them outwards.
Yeah. And the second part is really, really important, and something that I've seen is missing in at least the people I hang out with. That people can be really, really good at their own specific fields. They can be like geniuses. Like I've met really, really like people that just come naturally the technical aspect, but cannot talk to another person and does not know how to sell themselves. Doesn't know how to express what they're thinking. Doesn't know how to communicate the work that they've done so that other people understand. And that's probably something that you struggle with, teaching that to students.
Mm-hmm.
How would you approach that? How would you try to teach those sort of skills?
It depends on what the barrier is. So, for example, some people are just, to put it bluntly, interpersonally awkward, right?
Yes.
And it's fair enough. And
Yes,
probably
yes.
the last couple of, with the pandemic and everything, I think everyone's gotten a little more awkward interpersonally. And so it becomes about demonstrating that this is not some kind of theatrical performance. You don't have to be, quote unquote, charismatic or whatever that even means. You just have to understand yourself well and then communicate it outwards. And it can get depending on what the challenge is, it can get as specific as constructing formulas almost for how to explain a skill. So let's say that it's a technical position and the student is really confident in their technical skills, but we know they're going to get asked about things like teamwork and resilience and whatever. We'll coach them through, we'll just talk very normally about, all right, well, what have you done? What are some experiences? It doesn't even have to be formal. It can be just from your life. And then it can be, okay, here's your formula. I demonstrated the skill of teamwork during an important class project in the fall 2020 semester. My role was, and just really paint the picture.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to be that eloquent or charismatic. You just have to explain it.
Yeah. And I think for me, one of the main things that I advise to younger people is just practice doing that, right?
Yep.
Because at the end, practice doesn't necessarily makes you the expert on that, but it does make you better.
Right.
And that's what you want, right? You just want whatever baseline you have. If you're socially awkward, you're not going to be like giving speeches in next week, right? But with practice, maybe in some other time, you can be doing that, right? So at the end, it's just practice. Like a lot of the engineering people don't really think about this stuff. It's like, oh, when did I do teamwork and I had to deal with a difficult teammate or something like that? And really think about it. It doesn't really happen. And that's something that might happen with the other majors too, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think there's this idea that what we think of as transferable skills rather than technical, these things like communication, teamwork, whatever, they're highly valuable. But there's, I think, a perception that because they are almost indistinguishable from personal qualities, they're the kinds of things that just happen by living.
Yeah.
And that's just simply not the case.
Yeah, you have to practice.
As I tell the students a lot, if you're in college, if you're old enough to be in college, you are now past the point where you will get better at anything accidentally. You will only ever get better at anything on purpose.
Oh, that's cool.
Including things we think of as basic, like communication and teamwork and organization.
Yeah, you have to put the effort.
You have to do it on purpose.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's something that I think about it a lot, and I try to emphasize that. For example, I want to try to speak better. I want to try to communicate my ideas better. And I'm just going to do that by putting the effort. Maybe like a good starting place is just Googling how to speak, how to communicate my ideas. That can really give you a starting point, right? It'd be great if you have courses specifically for that, like Beyond 120. But yeah, it's just starting to think about this stuff is really important. For example, another thing that I thought was really cool about the courses that are offered in the Beyond 120 program is time management. So yeah, and I think that's something everybody struggles at some point of their life. I have definitely, like, I slept yesterday until 6 a.m. in the morning, which I shouldn't do.
You say you slept until 6 a.m. and that was too late?
That was late, yeah.
This is a true PhD student talking right now.
No, yeah, but that doesn't happen normally. I'm getting better at that. My normal schedule is 2 a.m., so it's better.
Wow.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah, it's not that bad. But yeah, that's something that people really struggle, right? And do you have sort of high-level techniques that people should approach this? Because I think it might be on a case-by-case basis that you might say, or just do whatever system works for you, or have you found like a good system that people can apply, that you can apply to any people in general, any person in general, and it makes them better to manage their time?
There's a couple, I think, and I think it is true that there are very few universals in this area. And, you may know this is it's become a very commodified space. There's not, time management gurus, and it's all about if you don't wake up at 4:30, you're not really trying, so I think a lot of this can be nonsense. But there are a couple of things that I have found really effective. David Allen wrote a book called Getting Stuff Done. And one of the strategies in that book that I have adopted and I have shared with students, I know students have said it's really impacted them, is what he calls the 2-minute rule. And for me, I kind of extend it to like the 5-minute rule. But it basically says if it takes 2 minutes or less, do it now. The reason for this has some backing in cognitive science. So my experience with college students is they rarely make big mistakes. But they make a lot of little ones because they're not organized.
Yeah.
And because they have so many little tasks building up, it creates cognitive load. It impacts focus. And so when they want to really sit down to do something, it's harder to do it well. And he uses the analogy of a basket. Empty your baskets. And so even if it's a tiny little thing entering the basket, it's still adding weight, and eventually it will overflow. So for example, for me, in general, I usually respond to emails extremely quickly, sometimes within seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because I'm especially conscientious. It's because email come in, I respond, it's now gone. It's gone. It's out.
Yeah.
It's out. And these
You don't have to
little
worry about that.
out of the basket. And what that does is when you declutter like that consistently, when you do need to sit down for a major, let's say it's for a student, a major studying hard for a test or working on a difficult paper, now all the clutter is out. And you can put full attention, and the inability to have extreme focus for long periods of time is something that I have noticed trip up a lot of students.
Yeah.
It's because they're not able to focus only on the task in front of them. They have 20 other little, I need to respond to so-and-so, and I have to clean my room, and I have to, if it takes 2 or 5 minutes or less, do it now.
Yeah. And also I've seen the real value of that, just getting deeply into an activity without any distractions at all. And of course, maybe a good rule is to not have the 2-minute rule in your allocated time for deep work. Like if you're gonna do something, and if you're gonna study for a paper at least for an hour, 2 hours, whatever, you're gonna do a project, you're gonna whatever, just do that. Put your phone like miles away.
Yes.
Put your distractions miles away and focus deeply on that, because of course social media and all of this really affects your brain, that you have to be constantly ingesting dopamine from any sort of activity. So that deep work is becoming less and less frequent in people. Do you have any advice on how to engage with deep work more frequently?
Yeah, so you're referring to a time management technique that is often referred to as tying yourself to the mast. It's a reference to the Odyssey and Odysseus, who they're sailing through, and the sirens are screeching, and the sirens, they bewitch, the men to their deaths, and he knows that he can't possibly resist their cry, so he has his crew literally tie him to the mast of his ship, so that he's not relying on his own self-discipline. It's out of his hands. And it is an incredibly effective technique. There are little things you can buy. These are brilliant, where they're little timed locks. Put your phone in the little box. You set like an hour timer. It will. There's nothing you can do to get your phone for an hour. It is in there. And there's a lot of little ways that you can, quote unquote, tie yourself to the mast. One of the ways that you can do this is just picking good locations to work.
Yeah. Getting
yourself out of your space, whether it's, it could be going to a library. It could be, I'll give you an example from my life. I have an office here on campus, and I work at home a lot too. But I tend to, particularly on the weekends, I do much better work. If I have to work on a weekend, I do much better work in my office, because there's fewer distractions. And what else am I going to do here but work? So sometimes, let's say it's a Friday, I might do this today. I'm getting ready to go home, and there's a couple of books that I know I'm going to need to do work over the weekend. I will intentionally leave them here rather than bring them with me, because then tomorrow when I wake up and I have to work, I'm going to go, I have to go to my office. And so the point is, a lot of people think that what they need to do is have better self-control. Nonsense. Our self-control loses every time. We have to sort of set scenarios to where we're not relying on our self-control. We just kind of back ourselves into a corner and we have to work.
Yeah. That's a very funny way to put it. I really like it. So another area that I think was really useful, that is not covered at least as much as people would like to, is personal finance. I think like you can always see those posts in like Twitter or Instagram or whatever, that it's like, I wish I learned this in college, and I never knew how to do my taxes. I never knew how to invest. I never knew how to keep a budget. How do you approach that with people? And it's really cool that you're doing that, at least for class. And another question is, have you seen a trend of increasing to teach that for the other majors, and why?
It's a good question. Frankly, I don't really know how the other colleges approach. I mean, certainly the College of Business, it's sort of their academic expertise. I'm sure those students get good training. Some universities have an actual sort of centralized office for financial advising, the way that you might for academic advising. To my knowledge, UF does not have that, and it's kind of decentralized to the various colleges. It's important, and one thing, this is true nationally, is that the primary reason for students dropping out of college is actually not academic. The primary reason for students dropping out of college is financial.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
And a large portion of that is things like credit card debt or irresponsible student loan behavior, right? So it's a very important thing. And to be clear, I am not a financial expert. I am merely an adult who has had to learn these things through experience, and I want to share with the students. So it's basically everything you said, basic budgeting. And a lot of my students are not fully responsible for their finances, which is fine. That's true of many college students, but that means they don't fully understand the scope of financial responsibility that a human life has. For example, they know they need to manage their money, but they're managing their money on lifestyle spending mostly. And maybe rent.
Right.
But they're not necessarily worried about taxes, and they're not necessarily worried about retirement saving, and they're not necessarily worried about setting financial goals, investing, these kinds of things. And then, they do what most people have done, is they get out into the world and they start making money, and then they
spend it.
They spend it, So what I try to do first and foremost when we cover personal finance is bring in an expert. And, one of the great things about UF is we have such incredible alumni. That one of the vice presidents of Morgan Stanley came and spoke to my class a few weeks ago just to give them an introduction, and we break it down. And it can be from budgeting to how to responsibly use a credit card, right?
Yes.
A credit card is a
just
powerful tool, and I think, look, if you're at the University of Florida, you're a pretty smart cookie, but you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of students, my experience is they don't even fully understand what credit is in a literal sense. And when they learn it, it kind of clicks. It's like, oh, got it. Now I know how to use this to my advantage. And so my experience is not high level stuff, but it's raising the bar. And one of the things the students have to do is they have to do some projection planning. So for example, all right, when you graduate, where do you want to live? Research the cost of living in that area. Contrast it to the mean or median salary of the industry. Now do a full budget, right? And I give them calculators to find all these things to do income tax and federal tax.
And there's definitely a lot of online calculators that you can find, the cost of living between the cities, between what you want to save, between what you earn. Yeah, there's definitely tools out there. You just gotta know that you have to do that. That not a lot of people know that.
That's right. And then, the other thing, of course, is investing. And I'm far from an expert. I've learned from experience. But one of the things, and the real expert who spoke to the class a couple weeks ago mentioned this, is for people who don't know much about it or are scared of it, it's easy to conceive it as gambling. And there's a version of it that can be.
Yes.
But there's a version of it that is pretty darn low risk. And as with most things, the lower the risk, the lower the return. But it is a pretty safe and reasonable way to build wealth over time rather than let your finances stagnate.
Yeah, and a lot of people have the thinking of like stacked thinking of you have something, it increases, but now that thing increases by percentage.
Interest.
And now that, basically interest. But I was trying to think of another fancier word. Not a lot of people have know the power of interest. And yeah, it's definitely something that I think people should at least look on their own and see resources that are online, because there's definitely are. Because just the problem is, as I said, you just have to know that you have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So another question is, and a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about is from the adulting course that you teach.
Yeah.
So is there anything else in that course that do you think is important and people can easily do on their own and research on their own, but they don't know that they have to do it?
The Art of Adulting is a fun course. From a practical standpoint, the time management and finance pieces are the primary things that are more practical. We spend some time in that course talking about the sociology and history of adulthood as a construct. But the other element I think that is really important that people can do on their own is finding mentors. This is a really huge thing, and you know this. You've mentioned how effective your PhD advisor is. No one is successful alone. No one. And you know, a university is nice because it provides a structure and it provides sort of some options for mentors, but you can just go find them. You put yourself in positions, reach out to people. I sometimes joke with my students that, especially when you're an undergraduate, you have kind of a puppy effect. You know, like most grown professionals want to help you. You know, they're like, oh, you're adorable. You're still, let me help you. And it's kind of like, you know, as soon as you graduate, kind of you're a full-grown dog now, right? It's like, go get a job. So, and I very much encourage students, you know, use things like LinkedIn or other, you know, or community events, and be bold and let people know what you want, and let people know that you're interested in what they do, and maybe you want to do what they do one day. They'll mostly be flattered. The worst thing that can happen is they ignore you.
Yeah, and that's okay.
And you're where you were before anyway.
Yeah.
There's almost no risk. So go find mentors. It's so important.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. And yeah, now that I've been in internship, I was trying to search for that actively, and I've seen the power of it. And it doesn't even have to be people that are already in their established things. It can also be like a peer, right?
Sure.
It can also be a student. Like it's really funny. While I was in an internship, it was like not an explicit deal, but an implicit deal that a friend of mine that he was in this company, he was teaching me how to code, and I was teaching how to play tennis. So it's like you give me something, I give you something. So yeah, I've really seen the power of it, because having that, at least a direction on what there is to know, is really useful. Again, because there's many things that I don't know that I don't know. And just having an opinion on what there is, it's important, because at the end, of course, you don't have to take your mentor's word as the Bible, right? It doesn't, like, you don't have to follow everything to the script of that what that person says, but at least it's a educated opinion based on experience, which is important, and that really gives you at least a data point on how to act in the world. For example, maybe can you speak of, have you had mentors yourself, and how did those relationships emerge? Did you ask them to be a mentor, or was that just something that naturally came to be?
I've been incredibly lucky. When I think of the different stages of my life and career, there have been mentors who have been very formative for me. And I think it's a little of both. So, for example, I'm thinking about when I think of my current mentors, one of them was one of my faculty during my master's program at the University of Kansas. And it was both organic and intentional, right? Because I was put in her orbit by being in the program. but I could have stopped right there. And I'm sure many students in the program never really got to know her very well. So I was given a little bit of a window, but I perceived her as someone I found interesting, that I found cool, that I found brilliant, and in a utilitarian way that I thought could be helpful to me as well.
Yeah.
And so I talked to her a lot. And I love that you mentioned reciprocal mentorship, because the reality is it doesn't go one way.
Yeah.
You know, sure. I took an interest in her. Hi, how are you doing? How's your kids? Yeah. Right? I mean, this stuff matters.
It does.
And so I think, you know, this kind of thing I was saying earlier about just reach out to people cold, it can be very powerful. But look, if you're a college student, you are in the orbit of at least several people who could be powerful mentors to you, but you're just in their orbit.
Yeah.
You can just kind of spin around them without making a meaningful connection very easily.
Yeah.
And then what generally happens, you graduate or the semester changes, and now they're out of your orbit.
Yeah.
So one of my little phrases for students is, don't let the good ones get away.
Yeah.
When you're in someone's orbit and you perceive them as a cool and meaningful person, you stick it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't let them go.
And you have to create some sort of value to the other person too, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be one way. And yeah, as you said, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I teach you something specific explicitly, but it can be, I learn about your life, and I can listen to what your problems are, and I can listen to what you're going through or whatever, right? It can be like, you can create relationships with older people already, like while you're in college. Like, a lot of people don't see it that way.
I think students, and I get it to some extent. I think undergraduates especially are very kind of scared of faculty, and I think I know that one of the most popular pieces of advice, but also one that I think a lot of students don't know what to do with, is go to office hours. And I think it's absolutely incredible advice, but I think it needs more specificity, because I think a lot of, especially for undergraduates, faculty can be intimidating, and you can't force it, right? You're not going to connect with everybody, but when there are those people you connect with, remember that they're human beings, you know, and to get real practical about it, as I remind my students, look, it doesn't matter how good your grades are. I can't tell you how many times, is another motivation for Beyond 120. I used to talk as seniors would come to me and they'd say, you know, I'm applying to graduate school. And I got to the part where it says 3 letters of recommendation. I never really got to know any of my professors. I was focused on being a good student. I have great grades. Isn't that enough? Not really. Right? The relationships are so important. And, you know, I maybe some of your friends have done this, but every faculty, I'm sure, gets these messages. I get them, which is some version of, hey, Professor Braun, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your class 3 years ago, and I'm applying to graduate school. And the only reasons I ever really say no to writing a letter of recommendation for a student is if I don't know them well enough to be specific.
Yeah. And it might be on their own.
Yeah.
Like, it can be damaging to them. Like, if you write a letter of, oh, I think this person was kind of cool. Like, he did well in my class, but I don't really know that person. So
exactly.
Right? It can be damaging.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. So, and a good point that you mentioned is, remember that faculty can be, it's not that they can be, they are a human too, right? They have doubts, they are not sure of themselves, or at least they can be, right? Have you felt that in yourself? Like, what are you, now that you're a director in a program and your faculty, so how has that changed your perspective to when you were a student? Has something changed?
You know, I don't know that I feel fundamentally different since I was like 15. I think there's some level of imposter syndrome that is perpetual.
Yeah, I think there is.
You know, I think I can't. I can only speak for myself. I don't know that much has changed. I have different kinds of responsibilities, you know, than I had as a student. And generationally, I'm very out of touch, as I learn a lot from them. But of course, I mean, absolutely. Not only are we also people, we're people first. Faculty is just our job, you know. And I think it's easy for students to forget that faculty, we have doubts, we have reservations, we get nervous before we teach. I mean, I was once teaching, and one of the students, we were talking about professional communication, public speaking. One of the students asked a question. She said something like, well, you know, but you're such a good speaker, and it's tough for us who get, you know, when we get nervous, you know, like, when was the last time you got nervous? And I looked at my watch and I was like, when did class start? You know, it doesn't really stop just because you get better at it. And the other thing is, as human beings, we are capable of genuinely liking or disliking other human beings. I like many of my students on a personal level. I think they're cool people. I might give them a bad grade on an assignment.
That's fine.
And I think that, and I get it, because the relationship is defined around teaching and learning. But I will say this, I guess. One thing that's changed is I have a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between student and teacher. Because as a student, my feeling was that my whole identity was whatever my academic work was. And that's the only thing my professors ever saw. Was they looked at me and they saw B or A or B plus or whatever. They didn't see Ryan. And again, I'm only speaking for myself, but I know this is true for many faculty members. No, I see both you, and of course I know what your grades are, but I also understand these are different things. I've had students come to me before and say, oh, you know, I know I'm not doing well in class. I wasn't sure if I should come. I was like, well, first of all, that's a great reason to come. But also, I don't really. You're welcome to talk with me. Whether you're doing well in my class or not.
Yes, I think that's really useful. Yeah, people really should keep that in mind. There's, at least from what I've seen, there's definitely people that are really, really confident, and they might not feel it at all. But from the large batch of population, a lot of them feel imposter syndrome. It's like, I'm just trying to figure it out. I'm getting better. I was definitely better than what I was 5 years ago, but I'm still a long way to go. And I'm still figuring it out, right? Which is important. So just to close, I want to touch also on your research. Because we've talked about undergrad experience a lot. I want to talk about your grad experience. What are you interested about academically? You mentioned that you sent to me a paper about violence on schools and the relationship it has on masculinity. So as you mentioned in that paper, there's definitely some strong correlation of violence incidents in schools and being a man. What do you think that is? And without taking the gender variable into account, or even taking the variable into account, what can we do? What can school administrators do on that side? What can students do on that problem?
Yeah, school violence has become sort of the animating intellectual problem that I'm interested in engaging with in a scholarly way. And I started thinking about extreme violence, things like shootings, because several of my students are from Marjory Stoneman Douglas.
Yes.
And
I've met many people from there.
Yes, indeed. And also when I was in graduate school in Kansas, several folks both Columbine and Aurora, were part of my program. So it's something I hadn't really thought about in tremendous depth. I had been researching other things, but I noticed there's a very kind of predictable rhetorical pattern that emerges following one of these incidents, which is one group of people will start talking about mental health.
Okay.
Right. And how it's a growing issue, and there is insufficient support for mental health struggles, which is true. And then other people will start talking about gun control, policies, legislation, guns are too easy to access, all these things. And what I found fascinating was that these two very reasonable and admirable discussions around guns and mental health basically completely dominated the discourse. And statistically speaking, to use the gender variable, 97% of school shootings are committed by men. And I no one seems to be discussing it. And it was very odd to me. They was discussing it in sort of very subtle ways, but it was fascinating to me that when things that we don't understand and that shock us happen, we want very concrete answers. What policy can we change, right? What agency can we better fund?
Yeah.
Because these are logistical problems, right? These are logistical answers. I have come to the conclusion that you can't solve a cultural problem with a logistical solution. And obviously there's a masculinity issue when it comes to violence because of the unbelievable connection, statistically speaking. So why is that? So I tend to research things historically, right? And so I believe the paper I sent you was about what we can't know it was the first, but it was likely the first widely discussed school shooting in the United States in 1840 at the University of Virginia. And all I was trying to do in that paper was put that particular incident into a cultural context of the antebellum South, in which conceptions of masculinity and honor were directly related to expressions of physical violence, and that to express violence publicly was a completely legitimate expression of manhood. And to say back down from a challenge would be shameful. And so the point there is that culturally we endorse violent masculinity in certain contexts, right?
Like sports.
Sport, right. And think about how it pervades our language. Be a man. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't really mean anything, but we know colloquially that it means be tough, be stoic, don't show your emotions, don't let anyone mess with you. And this is a real issue with the way that masculinity is socialized in the United States. And while the cultural conditions of the U.S. now are not what they were in 1840, obviously, my perspective is we see similar socialization around men.
Okay.
And one of the things that you'll see if you read literature on particularly the sociology of masculinity is that in many countries, but in an American context in particular, one thing that's true of men is that, number one, they are hyper aware of the ideal masculinity standards of their cultural environment.
Yeah.
And number two, they are hyper aware of the ways in which they do not live up to those standards.
Okay.
And that it can be a source of shame. And so in large and small ways, there is an attempt to reassert and close the gap between the ideal standard and what you perceive yourself to be. And a lot of this can be somewhat innocent, right? Go to the gym and get buff, or be a sports fan, or sort of ostentatiously eat meat and drink beer, whatever. But some of it's not so innocent. And from an intervention standpoint, this would be politically outrageous right now, probably, but you have to integrate it into the curriculum. You have to start talking about gender roles and socialization and its potential problems very early. We're in a political climate where that's almost impossible. I mean, we're seeing a kind of misrepresented version of critical race theory used as the sort of villain right now in a lot of contexts. So from a policy perspective, that likely wouldn't fly. But it's such an empty academic space. And it strikes me as concerning that no one wants to talk about this particular dimension of the problem.
So what would you're saying that you might propose integration of whatever solution you think it is to the curriculum. So what is that solution? What would you say to people in those courses or whatever structure? What could you say?
The easy answer is I don't know, right? I guess the more specific answer has something like, I think there's an understanding of, and certainly some people don't ever figure this out, but I think about my own personal journey of understanding that my own idea of what it meant to be a man was culturally constructed. It's not real, right? There's nothing I can do behaviorally to make me more or less of a man.
Okay.
And yet, I would not probably feel comfortable with the way that I've sort of traditionally presented myself, wearing, let's say, colored nails to work or a skirt. But why not?
Right.
This is arbitrary nonsense.
Yeah.
I can express myself that way if I want to. But even I, who studies this stuff, have internalized certain boundaries of how I, as a man in this culture, am supposed to act and the things that I'm supposed to like. And first step with all this stuff is just discourse, breaking it down. There is no standard. That a lot of this is power consolidation, and historically, military recruitment. I mean, there's you can point to certain reasons, but we have to start reminding people that there's actually no rules for identity. Okay. And these rules get us into a significant amount of trouble.
And it can be a nuanced conversation for sure, because you can definitely point out that it's not necessarily bad to be somebody that likes to eat meat and be tough and
right.
like be I want to do sports and what it's not necessarily bad. It's just that it doesn't have to be the ideal, right? It doesn't, like, for example, I do value being tough, let's say, not tough in the bad way that it's like nothing gets to you, tough in a way that you're resilient to challenges that face you. Like you can bounce back.
Sure.
Right? I think that's very valuable. It doesn't, so it's that nuanced conversation that you have to really think about what is useful for you. You have to think about what might be beneficial to you as a person, to the society, to your relationships, and to put it into practice. For example, I love sports, I love all that, but I don't, as you said, I don't think, I do think that the idea of being a man that likes violence is definitely wrong. Like, and I've seen it with some of people that I know. It's like, oh, this guy looked me bad, so I gotta. It's like, what are you looking at me bad? It's like, and start that fight that kind of proves that you're a man.
Right.
That's definitely problematic because it doesn't lead to anywhere, and you're not proving anything. Like, there's definitely some nuance, but it can be problematic. and it's cool that you say you don't really know what to teach, because it is difficult. But at least I do agree that having this conversation is very important.
As with most things,
Mm-hmm.
it starts off as kind of a weird, outlandish idea,
Mm-hmm.
and then it further penetrates, right? I mean, so many things that we take as sort of self-evident now were odd
Mm-hmm.
when they were first introduced. And it's a level of it's becoming more comfortable with uncomfortable conversations,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And to your point, there's a really important distinction between, so, you know, I study masculinity and violence, but one phrase you'll probably never hear me use is the phrase toxic masculinity, which is used a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because it's been misconstrued, but the fact that, as you point out, there are characteristics of what we think of as masculinity that are quite positive.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
This is about
That even women can benefit from them.
There's no question.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question. And so this is not about demonizing a gender or even a style. It's about identifying this somewhat specific cultural impulse to prove it. And prove it in particular ways that are damaging culturally. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking we can go into the other two debates on the other 2 points on mental health and guns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we're well over the hour. So
and I'm far from an expert on those as well.
Yeah, let's leave it at that. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for your time.
Thank you.
This was really great, and I think people are really gonna benefit from what you've said. As I said, I think one key lesson that people can get from these conversations is the university is a process, right? It's not after you finish, it's not the end. You have to think about, it's a way to get the tools that you need to be better prepared for when they throw you into the real world, right? Mm-hmm. And it's important to start thinking about what those tools are and what you need to get while you're here, because time is finite, and if you stay the whole 4 years or 5 years just taking classes and watching Netflix, it's not going to be as productive.
Yep.
You're not going to get as much out of it as possible. So yeah, definitely people should check out. And are non-class people, students allowed in the Beyond 120 program?
The Beyond 120 program is just for
class
College of Liberal Arts and Sciences students, but certainly happy to chat with any students from outside the college, or obviously any prospective students, folks in high school, in the application process. Happy to chat.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you
for your time. This was wonderful. And yeah, maybe the other topics we'll touch on in a next conversation we can have in the future. But thank you so much.
Thank you.